Before we dive into one of New Orleans' most haunting and complex stories from the late 19th century, I want you to know how much it means to have you here with me on this investigative journey, whether you're watching this from the bustling streets of a modern city or the quiet corners of a small town, whether it's morning coffee time or late-night curiosity that brought you here, your presence matters. Please take a moment to let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your world. It helps me understand the global community we're building together as we uncover these forgotten chapters of American history. What I'm about to share with you began with a single, yellowed newspaper clipping discovered in 2019 during the renovation of a Creole mansion in the French Quarter. The Times-Picayune dated March 15, 1896, carried a brief obituary that most readers would have skipped entirely. Celeste Boudreau, age 24, beloved sister and devoted member of our community, has passed into eternal rest. Services private. The Boudreau family requests privacy during this difficult time. It seemed unremarkable, just another death notice in a city where yellow fever, cholera, and violence claimed lives with disturbing regularity. But this simple obituary was the first thread that, when pulled, would unravel a story of exploitation, survival, and tragedy that reached into the highest echelons of New Orleans society and exposed a network of corruption that had operated in plain sight for decades. The discovery came when contractor Miguel Santos was removing damaged plaster from the walls of 1247 Royal Street, a three-story Creole townhouse that had stood since 1834. Hidden behind a false wall in what had once been the kitchen, Santos found a leather satchel containing dozens of documents, photographs, and personal letters spanning nearly 30 years. Among these papers were detailed financial records, correspondence with prominent New Orleans businessmen and politicians, and most disturbing of all, a ledger book that meticulously documented transactions that would make modern readers' blood run cold. The handwriting was elegant, educated, and belonged to someone who understood that these records needed to be preserved, perhaps as insurance, perhaps as evidence, or perhaps simply as a testament to lives that history had chosen to forget. To understand the full horror and complexity of what happened to the Boudreau sisters, we must first immerse ourselves completely in the New Orleans of the 1890s, a city unlike anywhere else in America, where the boundaries between races, classes, and moral codes blurred in ways that created both unprecedented opportunities and devastating vulnerabilities for those caught between worlds. New Orleans in 1896 was a city of approximately 287,000 residents, making it the 12th largest city in the United States and the largest in the South, but these numbers tell only part of the story of a metropolis that defied every convention of American urban life. The city sprawled along the crescent bend of the Mississippi River, 110 miles from the Gulf of Mexico, built on land that was technically below sea level and protected by an intricate system of levees that gave residents an almost fatalistic relationship with nature's power. The climate was subtropical and unforgiving, with summers that regularly reached temperatures above 95 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity levels that made the air feel thick enough to drink. From May through October, the threat of yellow fever hung over the city like a sword of Damocles. And the 1890s had seen several devastating outbreaks that claimed thousands of lives and sent those who could afford it fleeing to higher ground until the first frost made the city safe again. The French Quarter, or Vieux Carre, remained the beating heart of the city's cultural and economic life, its narrow streets lined with Creole cottages, Spanish colonial mansions, and French colonial townhouses that created a unique architectural tapestry found nowhere else in America. Royal Street, where our story unfolds, was considered one of the most prestigious addresses in the quarter, home to wealthy Creole families, successful merchants, and the kind of establishments that catered to gentlemen of means who valued discretion above all else. The street was paved with cobblestones that had been laid down in the 1850s, and gas lamps provided illumination after dark, though many residents still preferred the warm glow of oil lamps in their homes. The economic foundation of 1890s New Orleans rested on several pillars that created vast wealth for some while leaving others in desperate poverty. The Port of New Orleans was the second busiest in the United States, handling millions of tons of cargo annually as goods flowed down the Mississippi River from the American heartland and up from Latin America and the Caribbean. Cotton remained king, with massive warehouses along the riverfront storing bales destined for textile mills in New England and Europe. Sugar plantations in the surrounding parishes still operated much as they had before the Civil War, though now with paid labor that was often barely distinguishable from the slavery it had replaced. The city was also becoming a major center for coffee importation, and the aroma of roasting beans mixed with the smell of molasses, tobacco, and the ever-present dampness from the river to create New Orleans' distinctive olfactory signature. But perhaps more important than any legitimate business was the city's role as America's playground, a place where the strict moral codes that governed life in other American cities were relaxed or ignored entirely. New Orleans had always been different, shaped by its French and Spanish colonial heritage, its large population of free people of color, and its Catholic culture that viewed sin and redemption very differently than the Protestant morality that dominated the rest of the South. By the 1890s, this had evolved into a sophisticated economy of pleasure that attracted visitors from across the United States and around the world. The racial dynamics of 1890s New Orleans were extraordinarily complex, creating a three-tiered system that was unique in the American South. At the top were the whites, who controlled the major businesses, held political power, and lived in the grand mansions of the Garden District and the finest homes of the French Quarter. At the bottom were the blacks, who despite emancipation 30 years earlier, found themselves trapped in a system of Jim Crow laws and economic exploitation that kept most in poverty. But between these two groups existed a third category that had no real equivalent elsewhere in America, the gens de couleur libres, or free people of color, who had existed in New Orleans since the colonial period. This middle group included people of mixed African, European, and sometimes Native American ancestry who had been free for generations, many of whom had accumulated significant wealth and education. They operated their own businesses, owned property, and had developed a sophisticated culture that blended elements from all their ancestral traditions. Many spoke French as their first language, were educated in Europe, and lived lives that were virtually indistinguishable from their white neighbors except for the legal and social barriers that reminded them daily of their precarious position in society. Within this community of free people of color existed an even more specific and tragic subset, the Quadroons and Octoroons, women who were 1/4 or 1/8 African in ancestry and whose light skin, European features, and refined education made them objects of desire for white men who could not or would not marry them legally. The system that had developed around these women was called plaçage, a formalized arrangement where wealthy white men would enter into long-term relationships with Quadroon women, providing them with homes, financial support, and social status in exchange for companionship and sexual availability. The plaçage system had its own elaborate social structure, with the famous Quadroon balls serving as a kind of marriage market where young women of color were introduced to potential white protectors. These events were held at the Salle d'Orleans on Orleans Street, a grand ballroom that could accommodate hundreds of dancers, and they were attended by the most prominent men in New Orleans society. The mothers of Quadroon daughters would spend years preparing their girls for these events, ensuring they could speak perfect French, play piano, dance with grace, and conduct themselves with the kind of refined elegance that would attract a wealthy protector. By 1896, however, the plaçage system was beginning to break down under the pressure of changing social attitudes and new legal restrictions. The Civil War and Reconstruction had disrupted many of the old arrangements, and the rise of Jim Crow laws was making it increasingly difficult for relationships between white men and women of color to exist openly. At the same time, economic changes were creating new opportunities for women of all races to support themselves independently, though these opportunities were often limited and dangerous. It was into this complex and shifting world that Celeste and Marguerite Boudreau had been born, sisters whose story would illuminate both the possibilities and the perils of life for women of color in late 19th century New Orleans. The documents found in the Royal Street house reveal that they were the daughters of Marie-Claire Boudreau, herself a Quadroon who had been the placée of a wealthy cotton merchant named Henri Thibodeau from 1868 until his death in 1889. The girls had been raised in a comfortable Creole cottage on Ursuline Street, educated by private tutors, and groomed from childhood to follow in their mother's footsteps by entering into plaçage arrangements of their own. Celeste, the elder sister, was born on September 12, 1871, making her 24 at the time of her death in 1896. Contemporary descriptions, found in letters and diary entries among the discovered documents, paint her as a woman of extraordinary beauty, with café au lait skin, dark hair that fell in waves to her waist, and green eyes that several correspondents described as mesmerizing. She spoke fluent French and English, could read Latin, played both piano and violin with professional skill, and had been educated in literature, mathematics, and the social graces that were considered essential for a woman of her station. More importantly, she possessed what one admirer called an intelligence that could not be hidden behind even the most demure smile. Marguerite, born on April 3, 1874, was 3 years younger and described by those who knew her as possessing a different kind of beauty than her sister. Where Celeste was elegant and refined, Marguerite was vivacious and charming, with a laugh that could fill a room and a personality that drew people to her like moths to a flame. She had inherited her mother's talent for music and could sing in 4 languages, often performing at private gatherings in the homes of New Orleans elite. Both sisters were accomplished dancers, having been trained from childhood in the elaborate quadrilles and waltzes that were essential skills for the Quadroon balls. The sisters' mother, Marie Claire, had been determined that her daughters would make advantageous connections that would secure their futures in an increasingly uncertain world. She had saved money from her arrangement with Henri Thibodeau, investing in real estate and a small millinery business that catered to wealthy Creole women. When Thibodeau died in 1889, leaving the family a modest inheritance but no ongoing support, Marie Claire knew that her daughters would need to find protectors of their own if they were to maintain their position in society. The first indication that something was amiss in the Boudreau family's carefully planned future came in the form of a letter dated January 15, 1895, found among the papers in the Royal Street house, written in Celeste's elegant handwriting to her sister, who was apparently staying elsewhere at the time. It read, "My dearest Marguerite, I fear we have made a terrible mistake in trusting Monsieur Dufresne with our futures. What he promised as protection has become something far more sinister, and I worry that we are trapped in a web from which there may be no escape. Maman believes we must honor our commitments, but I see now that honor means nothing to men who view us as commodities to be bought and sold. Please be careful, ma chère sœur, and remember that whatever happens, we have each other." Monsieur Dufresne, whose full name was revealed in the documents as Jean-Baptiste Dufresne, was a prominent New Orleans businessman who owned several cotton warehouses, a small shipping company, and significant real estate holdings throughout the city. Born in 1845 to a wealthy Creole family, he had inherited his father's business empire and expanded it considerably during the post-war economic boom. By 1895, he was estimated to be worth over $500,000, making him one of the wealthiest men in New Orleans. He was married to Isabelle Marigny, daughter of another prominent Creole family, and they lived in a mansion on St. Charles Avenue with their 4 children. But Dufresne's public respectability masked a darker reality that the discovered documents reveal in disturbing detail. Rather than entering into traditional placage arrangements with the Boudreau sisters, he had convinced their mother to allow both daughters to live in a house he owned on Royal Street, ostensibly as his places but actually as part of what can only be described as a sophisticated prostitution operation that catered to wealthy men from across the United States and Europe. The ledger book found in the house reveals the horrifying scope of Dufresne's operation. Written in a code that took historians months to decipher, it documents transactions involving not just the Boudreau sisters but at least 12 other young women of color, all of whom lived in houses owned by Dufresne throughout the French Quarter. The entries show that clients paid anywhere from $50 to $500 per encounter, depending on the specific services requested and the status of the client. To put this in perspective, the average working man in New Orleans earned about $400 per year, making these transactions extraordinarily lucrative for Dufresne, while the women themselves received only a small fraction of the money. More disturbing still are the client lists, which read like a who's who of American society in the 1890s. Politicians, judges, businessmen, and even clergy are listed by name, along with their preferences and the amounts they paid. Among the most frequent clients was Judge Armand Beauregard of the Louisiana Supreme Court, who apparently visited the Royal Street house twice weekly and paid premium rates for what the ledger euphemistically calls exclusive arrangements. Also listed are Senator Charles Morrison from Mississippi, railroad magnate William Pemberton from Chicago, and dozens of other men whose names would have been recognized by anyone who read the society pages of American newspapers. The documents also reveal that Dufresne's operation was protected by an elaborate network of corruption that reached into every level of New Orleans government. Police Captain Francois Treme received monthly payments of $200 to ensure that the houses were never raided, while City Councilman Robert Dupuis was paid $100 monthly to prevent any ordinances that might interfere with the business. Even more shocking, Mayor Walter Flower himself appears to have been a client, with several entries in the ledger showing payments made on his behalf by intermediaries. The daily reality for the Boudreau sisters and the other women trapped in Dufresne's network was one of carefully maintained appearances hiding desperate circumstances. During the day, they lived lives that appeared almost normal, shopping in the French market, attending Mass at St. Louis Cathedral, and maintaining the social connections that were essential to their survival. But evenings brought a parade of clients who viewed them not as human beings but as exotic objects to be used and discarded. Letters between the sisters, found scattered throughout the documents, provide heartbreaking glimpses into their emotional state during this period. Marguerite wrote to Celeste in March 1895, "I dreamed again last night of our childhood, when we believed that beauty was a gift from God rather than a curse that marks us for destruction. Do you remember how we used to dance in Mammon's garden, pretending we were princesses in a fairy tale? Now I understand that we were never destined to be princesses. We were always meant to be the dragon's treasure, locked away for the pleasure of knights who have no intention of rescuing us." The psychological toll of their situation was compounded by the complete isolation they experienced from their former community. The respectable Creole families who had once welcomed them now shunned them, understanding instinctively that their circumstances had changed even if they didn't know the specific details. At the same time, they were cut off from their mother, who had apparently been told by Dufresne that contact with family would interfere with their professional obligations. The beginning of the end came in the winter of 1895, when Celeste apparently began trying to document Dufresne's operation, possibly with the intention of exposing it or using the information to secure their freedom. The cache of documents suggests that she was methodically copying entries from Dufresne's ledgers, photographing important papers, and collecting evidence of the corruption that protected the network. A letter from December 1895 shows that she had made contact with a journalist from the New Orleans item named Thomas Kearney, who was apparently investigating rumors of high-level corruption in city government. Kearney's own notes, found among the papers, reveal that he had been working on an exposé of what he called the most sophisticated and far-reaching criminal enterprise in the history of New Orleans. He had identified connections between Dufresne's operation and similar networks in other southern cities, suggesting that what was happening in New Orleans was part of a much larger system of exploitation that trafficked women across state lines. His investigation had apparently attracted the attention of federal authorities, who were beginning to take an interest in what they saw as violations of the Mann Act, even though that legislation wouldn't be passed until 1910. But Kearney's investigation came to an abrupt halt in January 1896. When he was found dead in his apartment from what the coroner ruled was a heart attack. That he was 32 years old and had no history of heart problems. His notes and research materials disappeared from his apartment before police arrived, though copies had apparently been hidden by Celeste in the Royal Street house, which explains how they came to be part of the discovered cache. The final weeks of Celeste's life can be reconstructed from a series of increasingly desperate letters she wrote to various people, apparently trying to find someone who would help her and her sister escape their situation. She wrote to a cousin in Mobile, Alabama, asking if they could come for an extended visit. She contacted a convent in Baton Rouge, inquiring about the possibility of taking religious vows. She even wrote to the French consul in New Orleans, claiming that as the descendant of French colonists, she and her sister should be entitled to protection under French law. None of these appeals were successful, and by March 1896, Celeste appears to have realized that there was no legal or conventional way out of their predicament. Her final letter, written to Marguerite just days before her death, reveals a woman who had reached the end of her psychological endurance. "Ma chère sœur, I can no longer bear the weight of what we have become. Every morning I wake hoping that this nightmare will end. And every evening I realize that it will continue until we are too old or too broken to be of use to these men. That I have tried every door, and they are all locked from the outside. Perhaps there is only one door left, and though it terrifies me to think of it, it may be the only one that leads to freedom." Celeste Boudreau died on March 13, 1896, officially from what the death certificate lists as consumption, though no doctor's examination was recorded and no family member was present to confirm the cause of death. Her body was found in her room at the Royal Street house by a servant, who reported that she appeared to have died peacefully in her sleep. She was buried in St. Louis Cemetery No. 2 in an unmarked grave, with only Marguerite and their mother present at the brief service, but the documents found in the house tell a different story. A note in Dufresne's handwriting, apparently intended for his own records, states simply, "C.B. became increasingly difficult to manage and was threatening to expose the operation. Problem resolved permanently. M.B. has been informed that any similar behavior will result in similar consequences. The clinical coldness of this note, treating Celeste's death as merely a business problem that had been solved, reveals the complete dehumanization that characterized Dufresne's attitude toward the women under his control. Marguerite's situation became even more precarious after her sister's death. Letters from the spring and summer of 1896 show that she was struggling with severe depression and what would today be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. She wrote to a friend, "Since Celeste left me, I feel as though I am living in a world made of glass, where everything is fragile and nothing is real. I go through the motions of life, but inside I am already dead, waiting only for my body to catch up with my spirit." The final entry in Dufresne's ledger regarding Marguerite is dated September 15, 1896, and simply states, M.B. No longer profitable, arrangements made for disposal. What exactly this meant remained unclear until 2019, when construction work on a house in the Bywater district uncovered human remains that DNA testing confirmed belonged to a young woman of mixed African and European ancestry who had died sometime in the late 19th century. While definitive identification was impossible, the timing and circumstances strongly suggest that these were Marguerite's remains. The broader network that Dufresne had created continued to operate for several more years, though it apparently became more careful about record-keeping after the sisters' deaths. The cache of documents includes evidence that the operation expanded during the late 1890s, with houses established in Mobile, Savannah, and Charleston, all following the same model of exploiting young women of color under the guise of traditional placeage arrangements. The end came suddenly in 1901, when a federal investigation into interstate commerce violations led to raids on several of Dufresne's properties. By this time, however, Dufresne had apparently been warned of the coming investigation and had fled to France, where he lived comfortably on his accumulated wealth until his death in 1923. Most of the other men involved in the network escaped prosecution by claiming ignorance of the true nature of the operation, and the few who were charged received minimal sentences. The psychological and sociological analysis of this case reveals layers of exploitation that went far beyond simple prostitution. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a historian at Tulane University who has studied the documents extensively, argues that what happened to the Boudreaux sisters represents a perfect storm of racial, gender, and economic oppression that was unique to the post-Reconstruction South. These women were trapped not just by one man's greed, Dr. Martinez explains, but by an entire social system that had created a category of people who were considered too white to be treated like other African Americans but too black to be protected by white society. The placeage system, which had once provided some measure of security and status for women of color, had been corrupted into something far more sinister by men who understood that the changing legal and social landscape created new opportunities for exploitation. The sisters' education and refinement, which should have been assets, instead made them more valuable as commodities in a market that prized the illusion of sophistication and consent. The role of corruption in enabling Dufresne's operation cannot be overstated. The documents reveal a web of complicity that extended from street-level police officers to the highest levels of city and state government. This corruption was not incidental to the operation but essential to it, creating a protective bubble that allowed the network to function openly for years without interference. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence that similar operations existed in other cities throughout the South and beyond. Letters found in the cache reference contacts in New York, Philadelphia, and even London, suggesting that the trafficking of women was already an international enterprise decades before it would be recognized as such by law enforcement. The sophistication of these networks, with their careful record-keeping, client management, and political protection, reveals a level of organization that challenges common assumptions about historical criminal enterprises. The impact on the broader community of free people of color in New Orleans was devastating and long-lasting. The exposure of Dufresne's operation, even though it came years after the fact, reinforced negative stereotypes about women of color and provided ammunition for those who argued that the placeage system was inherently immoral. Many families who had participated in traditional placeage arrangements found themselves ostracized, and the entire community became more insular and defensive. The legal implications of the case were equally significant. The evidence of interstate trafficking helped build support for federal legislation that would eventually become the Mann Act, also known as the White Slave Traffic Act, which made it a federal crime to transport women across state lines for immoral purposes. However, the law's focus on white slavery meant that it provided little protection for women of color, who continued to be vulnerable to exploitation well into the 20th century. From a medical and psychological perspective, the case provides early documentation of what we now understand as human trafficking trauma. The letters and personal writings of the Boudreaux sisters show clear symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, including dissociation, depression, and suicidal ideation. Their attempts to maintain normal social relationships while enduring systematic abuse illustrate the psychological compartmentalization that trafficking victims often develop as a survival mechanism. The economic analysis of Dufresne's operation reveals the enormous profits that could be generated through the systematic exploitation of vulnerable women. The ledger shows that the Royal Street House alone generated over $50,000 per year in revenue, equivalent to more than $1.5 million in today's money. When multiplied across all of Dufresne's properties, the total revenue likely exceeded $200,000 annually, making it one of the most profitable criminal enterprises in the South. The international connections revealed in the documents also provide insight into the global nature of human trafficking in the late 19th century. Letters reference clients from England, France, and Germany, as well as arrangements for women to be transported to brothels in European cities. This suggests that New Orleans served as a hub in an international network that exploited the city's unique cultural and racial dynamics to provide exotic experiences for wealthy men from around the world. The religious and cultural context of the case adds another layer of complexity to the story. The sisters were raised as Catholics and maintained their faith throughout their ordeal, attending Mass regularly and seeking comfort in prayer. Their letters contain numerous references to their struggle to reconcile their religious beliefs with their circumstances, and Celeste's final letters suggest that she may have viewed her death as a form of martyrdom that would free her from an impossible situation. The preservation of the documents themselves raises important questions about memory, evidence, and historical truth. The fact that Celeste apparently risked her life to document Dufresne's operation suggests that she understood the historical importance of preserving evidence of these crimes. Her careful organization of the papers, including detailed annotations and cross-references, indicates that she may have hoped the truth would eventually come to light, even if she didn't live to see it. The discovery of the documents in 2019 has had a profound impact on how historians understand both the placage system and the broader history of human trafficking in America. Dr. James Thornton of Louisiana State University, who led the team that analyzed the papers, argues that the case forces us to reconsider our assumptions about the agency and autonomy of women of color in the post-Reconstruction South. These women were not passive victims but active resistors who used every tool at their disposal to fight against their exploitation, even when those tools were limited and ultimately insufficient. The case has also influenced contemporary discussions about human trafficking and sexual exploitation. Advocates point to the Boudreaux sisters' story as evidence that trafficking has deep historical roots in America and that the vulnerability of women of color to exploitation has remained consistent across centuries. The sophisticated nature of Dufresne's operation, with its careful client management and political protection, mirrors many aspects of modern trafficking networks. The legal precedents established by the case continue to influence contemporary jurisprudence. The evidence of interstate trafficking helped establish federal jurisdiction over crimes that had previously been handled only at the local level, and the documentation of political corruption provided a model for investigating organized criminal enterprises. The case is now studied in law schools as an early example of what would later be called racketeering. The psychological impact of the case extends beyond the immediate victims to their families and community. Marie-Claire Boudreaux, the sisters' mother, lived until 1923 but never spoke publicly about what happened to her daughters. Neighbors reported that she became increasingly reclusive after their deaths and was often seen placing flowers on unmarked graves in St. Louis Cemetery No. 2. Her own death certificate lists the cause as melancholia, a 19th-century term for severe depression. The broader implications for understanding American history are equally significant. The case illustrates how the end of slavery did not end the exploitation of African Americans but simply transformed it into new forms that were often more subtle but no less devastating. The intersection of race, gender, and class that trapped the Boudreaux sisters was not unique to New Orleans but reflected broader patterns of oppression that existed throughout the post-Reconstruction South. the international dimensions of the case also challenge traditional narratives about American exceptionalism. The evidence that wealthy Americans were participating in an international network of sexual exploitation suggests that the moral corruption associated with European decadence was equally present in American society, despite the country's self-image as a beacon of virtue and freedom. As we reflect on the story of Celeste and Marguerite Boudreau, we must grapple with the uncomfortable truth that their fate was not an aberration but part of a systematic pattern of exploitation that has persisted throughout American history. Their story reminds us that behind every statistic about human trafficking are individual human beings with hopes, dreams, and the fundamental right to dignity and freedom. The courage that Celeste showed in documenting Dufresne's operation, even at the cost of her own life, serves as a powerful reminder that resistance takes many forms and that the preservation of truth is itself an act of defiance against oppression. Her careful organization of the evidence that would eventually expose the network demonstrates a faith in justice that transcended her own circumstances and speaks to the resilience of the human spirit even in the darkest situations. Today, as we continue to fight against human trafficking and sexual exploitation around the world, the story of the Boudreau sisters provides both inspiration and warning. It shows us that these crimes are not new phenomena but have deep historical roots that must be understood if we are to address them effectively. It also reminds us that the vulnerability of marginalized communities to exploitation requires constant vigilance and active protection from those with the power to make a difference. The legacy of Celeste and Marguerite Boudreau lives on not just in the documents they left behind but in every effort to protect vulnerable women and girls from exploitation. Their story challenges us to look beyond the comfortable narratives we tell ourselves about progress and justice and to confront the uncomfortable truths about how power, privilege, and prejudice continue to create opportunities for those who would prey upon the vulnerable. As you reflect on this story, I encourage you to consider how the dynamics that trapped the Boudreau sisters continue to operate in our world today. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you know of similar stories from your own community or family history, please consider sharing them as well. Only by bringing these hidden histories to light can we hope to prevent future tragedies and honor the memory of those who suffered in silence for too long.